If I'd have been standing right here 400 years ago, 1607, January the 30th, I'd have had a significant problem. Something devastating happened here in the Severn Estuary that seems to have been largely forgotten. And yet here we are now, 400 years on, and we still can't agree on exactly what that was. Along this stretch of coastline between England and Wales, on what should have been an ordinary morning, January 1607, people would look out across this estuary, see something strange, something terrifying. They would write about it and try and explain it, and here we are 400 years on, reading their very words. Now you might be thinking, okay, this sounds like a forgotten story about a big flood. Tragic of course, but not really mysterious, until of course you start to scratch the surface, because over the last 20 years or so, a completely different idea has evolved. Now some researchers believe that this wasn't a flood at all, nothing to do with the Severn bore, no perfect storm here. Some researchers believe this was a tsunami, and we're not talking about the Doggerland tsunami of the North Sea and beyond. This is a tsunami within recorded history. Others are equally convinced that's wrong. They say the evidence points to something else entirely. So somewhere in this vast landscape around here, somewhere on one of these single most dangerous coastlines in the world with the second highest tidal range in the world, lies the answer that we're looking for. So was this indeed the perfect storm that affected hundreds of miles of coastal and inland populations, or perhaps something far more sinister? So 400 years ago, something very strange happened here in the Severn Estuary. In fact, from Cornwall, Devon, up into Somerset and up through this estuary here behind us, it affected thousands of people, and we still can't agree on exactly what it was. I find this really curious. This is something relatively new that I've learned about myself, so let's explore it. Instead, this place carries on much as it always has. The tide comes in, the tide goes out, and apart from the occasional Severn bore, well, most of us never really give this stretch of coastline a second thought. But somewhere along these banks, 400 years ago, something happened that people struggled to explain, even at the time. The people that witnessed this, well, they wrote about it. Churches in the area, they made pamphlets about what had happened, and this story spread across England and Wales, and the story lived with us, seemingly for quite some time. But then we stopped talking about it, and I guess the strange thing for me isn't the fact that we stopped talking about it and it's not a well-known event in history. The strange thing for me is we still don't really know exactly what happened, which is odd because we have a tsunami documented from Doggerland, something like 8,000 BC. This is just 400 years ago. So before we get into the theories, before we ask whether this was an extraordinary flood or something much more remarkable, we need to go back to the very beginning. To a winter morning, 1607, January the 30th, approaching midday. That is exactly where our mystery today begins. This was a Saturday morning, and life around the estuary, people that worked on it, the flat fields and farmers around here, life probably started exactly as it normally does. The tide was on its way out, and we can start to see many of the mud flats of the Severn Estuary, as we can see right now at this moment. Then something dramatic changed. Now we don't know who saw this first, but we do have contemporary reports from the time. In fact, one written almost immediately here says, "A most fearful and horrible inundation of waters." Another spoke of the sea advancing with such force that people had almost no time to escape. These weren't stories written centuries later. They were written by people contemporary of the time. They were written by people trying to make sense of what had just happened to them. They were written by churches in the form of pamphlets, and people wrote they climbed onto trees, they climbed on rooftops to try and escape this inundation of water. Water swept across the low-lying land with astonishing speed, overwhelming fields, roads, homes, before many people realised what was happening. And then reports began to appear from both sides of the estuary, from South Wales, Somerset, Gloucester, Devon. Communities separated by miles, communities separated from different sides of the estuary. They were all writing the same details, the same story from that same morning. Whatever happened here was huge. Okay, so exactly how big was this disaster? Well, the first thing to do is map everywhere that recorded this incident at the time. Now when you first read about this, well, it first of all seems like this is just something that was specific to Bristol itself. It wasn't. There are contemporary reports from Appledore and North Devon, along the Somerset coast, along the Gwent levels in South Wales, and right up to the Severn Estuary near Gloucester. So that's over 100 miles of coastline. Whatever happened here was absolutely enormous. Okay, so let's move on from the maps now and start having a look at what people actually said about this at the time. That's where the real clues start. Now this is St Arolda's Church, and we have this wonderful view looking at that very coastline. This sits on top of the hill on a very sort of curious mound. That's one of a better word. It's almost like probably like an Iron Age enclosure. I think there's a ditch all around this, and yeah, we have this from the 12th century plonked right in the middle. Now if we're going to understand what happened here, well, the eyewitnesses are where we need to begin. The first clue is the speed. Again and again we have people describing how quick this happened. We have a contemporary pamphlet from the time. Not sure why that was a thing, but nevertheless it described people clambering up trees, climbing onto rooftops, trying to get away as quick as they could, many of them not even making it that far. The second is a distance. Modern reconstruction suggests around 570 square kilometres of low-lying land may have been completely flooded across the Gwent levels, across Somerset levels. That's a vast distance. At Kingston Seymour Church, a flood marker records the water reaching around 5 feet inside the building. 4 centuries on, this is one of the clearest reminders that this is no ordinary high tide. This was devastating. And then there's one more clue which makes us rethink this perhaps in a different way. A pamphlet from just a couple of weeks after this event, and it describes seeing huge and mighty hills of water tumbling over one another. Now that is an extraordinary description because it isn't how most people would describe a slow rising flood water. Finally, there's what's missing. You see, across all of these contemporary accounts, we didn't really hear of any torrential rain, super strong winds. We don't hear of buildings being torn apart. We don't hear what you would expect to hear from a significant storm. Some later researchers would argue those conditions certainly existed. Others point out how rarely they appear in eyewitness accounts. I love the idea of this church and this really curious hill stood out in the landscape here being sort of a place of refuge maybe after that flood down below there. And that's where this story takes a significant turn, because nearly 400 years on from that disaster, well, two researchers would sit down with all of these clues, the same evidence, the same accounts of people describing it, and they would come to a very different conclusion, one that wasn't a flood at all. In 2002, geographers Hazlitt and Bryant stepped in and they published a short paper. In that paper they simply asked the question, is it possible that this flood from 1607 was actually caused by a tsunami? Their argument began with the accounts we've already seen, people caught with almost no warning, huge and mighty hills of water apparently tumbling over one another. Remarkably little of those accounts described anything like a storm you would associate with a flood. The descriptions that we see, well, Hazlitt and Bryant are pretty certain they are the descriptions you'd see with those actions of a tsunami. So they went looking along the Bristol Channel for physical evidence, and at several places along the South Wales coast they found enormous boulders sitting above the normal reach of the sea. At Sully Island, some had been lifted from the shore platform and moved inland. Others appear to have been turned over and arranged in the same direction, something Bryant and Hazlitt argued required an exceptional surge of water. They measured the rocks, estimated the force needed to move them, and calculated flow speeds powerful enough to carry tons of stones across the coast. They then also identified strange erosion on exposed rock platforms, channels cut out through the surface, rock surfaces sculptured and moved, ramps which appear to have directed water inland. Now none of this is sort of labelled with this convenient, yep, this is 1607, but when they combined this physical evidence with the contemporary reports, well, they seem to think they're describing exactly the same thing. And the shape of the Bristol Channel could of course made this a lot worse. A wave entering from the Atlantic would be forced into an estuary which becomes narrower and shallower as it travels east, which gives us a possible explanation of the extraordinary reach of this flooding. Well, if Hazlitt and Bryant are right in their paper, then Britain experienced a tsunami, a monumental one, that somewhere off of the coast, Devon, Cornwall, in that direction, that devastated this landscape here and affected thousands of people. I've kind of been sold on that idea, but then I read about the counter argument. It all seems to point in one direction. But then I came across another paper, this time not from a tsunami researcher, but from oceanographers. Another church, another potential place of refuge as we sit just above the flatter land below us, just there. So, 2006, Horsburgh and Horrett oceanographers looked at the very same event, and they started with the estuary itself, the Bristol Channel, the Severn Estuary. As we said earlier, one of the most significant ranges in the high and low tide, differing in 14 metres in places. That's one of the things that gives us the Severn bore. So they looked at the details for 1607, and it wasn't just a high tide. I'm not going to get in this time. It was an exceptionally large spring tide at a deep area of low pressure, strong southwesterly winds driving the water into the estuary, and then suddenly the mathematics of this all began to change. They concluded that an extremely strong surge arriving at exactly the wrong moment could have produced flooding remarkably similar to this event described in 1607, and they didn't stop there. They argued that many of the clues used to support the tsunami theory weren't unique to a tsunami at all. Large boulders can be moved by repeated storms. Now, when you look at eyewitness accounts of extremely traumatic events, well, understandably they can tend to be either oversimplified or they can be very much exaggerated. Even that famous description, the hills of water, well, that doesn't necessarily mean tsunami. And there's one other significant problem with all of this, the tsunami theory. If it was a tsunami, but where exactly did it come from? And perhaps, just perhaps, maybe this story of Britain's forgotten tsunami actually then becomes Britain's forgotten disastrous storm. Let's not underplay it. But remember, we have scans of the seabed like nothing else around this country and oceans beyond. And of course, we can identify where the tsunami for the Doggerland, the Staggering effect, took place, and yet we haven't come across one for this. So where exactly does that leave us? What's the conclusion here? Because we have these extraordinary accounts from people at the time, we have wonderful geological evidence, and yet if there's a place that was ever going to produce an event like this, it was going to be here, the Severn Estuary. So does that mean I think that perhaps the tsunami, that theory is completely impossible? Well, no. So I wrote a conclusion based on me supporting the flood theory, the storm surge, but having mapped the places that recorded this event, the thing that swings it for me is, well, Barnstable. None of the evidence that details the surge, the thinning of the Severn Estuary, really works here, because it's all the way down here. Surely only a tsunami could span that distance. Oh, disastrous storm or tsunami. Maybe we'll never know, maybe we will, but whichever way you look at it, I guess the real question is, how did something that happened 400 years ago in written, documented history, something so monumental and devastating as this, simply become something that hardly anyone today talks about or sort of learns about in any capacity? I hope you found it interesting. I certainly have. I've been Paul. I'll see you this time next Sunday.